All right, let's talk about the page call process. Drupal 8 utilizes an architecture where the index.php file acts as a front controller. Drupal runs on PHP. The browser locates index.php for all of the directions that it needs. So if we open up index.php and look at the code, you'll see there are two main classes being utilized here. The Drupal kernel, which was originally based on Symfony's HTTP kernel, but was modified by the Drupal team to add some Drupal-specific functionality, and the Symfony class component HTTP Foundation request. So if we open up index.php from our core Drupal site, go ahead and do that if you want, you'll notice there are two classes being used, the Symfony component HTTP Foundation request and Drupal core Drupal kernel class. Now, the Drupal kernel is basically what boots Drupal into a usable state. It's built on the HTTP Foundation request class, but it's been enhanced to add Drupal-specific functionality. So when you land on the index.php of a Drupal site, Drupal does everything it needs to make sure it's good to go. Among those checks, it makes sure it's properly installed, has any PHP configuration it needs completed, registers the site path, the namespaces of any enabled modules, make sure any services, things like the database and other services contributed by modules, they're ready, and once it's content with the environment it has, it processes your request. Symfony's HTTP Foundation component defines an object-oriented layer for the HTTP specification. The request holds information about the client's request and sends its request back to the Drupal site once the Drupal kernel gives the response object. And you can see more about that at the link on the screen. Before we move on, let's talk about the Drupal directory structure. Let me open it up in my HTML editor. I'm using Coda for the Mac. It puts the folders at the top. The core folder here is where obviously everything from core resides. We never hack core. We borrow from core. We refer to core, but we never hack core. Modules folder is where we'll put today's class. Profiles, sites, themes, and then vendor are all folders that Drupal uses in order to run. And we'll be creating a custom folder where our modules will reside. If you're worried about this .ds store, don't worry, that's just a Mac thing. You'll notice I've already installed admin toolbar, and if you want to go ahead and do that before we dive into the code, you can do that at your own leisure. Back under core and then modules, you'll now see all of the modules that come with Drupal core. For instance, here's entity reference. Here's the date module. Here's the comment module, CK editor module. Here's the path auto module and the simple test module and the telephone module. Well, you get the idea. These are all core modules. Once again, we never edit those. We might borrow from them, but we don't edit them. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the index.php file acts as a front controller, takes the request object, and produces a response object. And so we have the request, the router, controller, view, and response. Let's talk about each one of these. Routing is an integral part of the page request process. When a site visitor goes to, say, example.com/about on a Drupal 8 site, Drupal will reference all the routes registered and send the request over to the controller or form associated with the route that fits the pattern. So the request comes in, the router puts it to the right place, and then sends it to the controller. The controller builds the response for a given request. This could be an HTML page, a JSON string, or anything else. For normal website pages, the controller will return a render array, but the controller can also return an example JSON type data. Next, we have the view. The view creates the response. So the controller builds the response, the view creates the response. Drupal will render the render array using the Twig templating system. The HTTP output is stored in a response object, and this response object is what the Symfony kernel uses to store the response in while preparing it. When completed, the HTTP response will be returned. Drupal renders this array or response object in the theming layer, hence the Twig templates and CSS that produce the HTML for the complete page. Once Drupal has created the page, Symfony's HTTP Foundation /request component sends the result back to the site visitor, and this is the response phase. Assuming that the page they were looking for exists, for instance our /about page, it now shows up in their browser. Otherwise they'll see something like a 404 or a 403. So you've probably heard at least a little bit about the Drupal 8 framework and how it now utilizes Symfony. Symfony is an integral part of Drupal 8. Symfony components are at the heart of Drupal core. It's important to understand that not all the Symfony 2 framework was included in Drupal 8, and Drupal 8 is made up of much more than just Symfony components. We'll find that Drupal 8 attempts to optimize the best of Drupal procedural systems with the modern standards of Symfony and additional vendor services. You saw those vendor services in the folders a few moments ago. If you're a Symfony developer, well then you already know a lot about how Drupal 8's event system works, what a service is, and how it relates to the dependency injection container at the very root of how Drupal request response workflow works. If you're not a Symfony developer, well then you've got a bit to learn, and it would be a good idea to take a look at some of their documentation. Drupal 8 also uses other libraries. For instance, Composer is used to help autoload classes, files, namespaces, and such. Twig is used for templating and theming. PHP Unit for unit testing. Here in the vendor folder we looked at just a moment ago, you'll see a whole nother list of vendor libraries that are used in Drupal 8. Here in Core, Assets, Vendor, again, you'll see even more. These libraries are available to use in themes and modules. For instance, this is where assets like jQuery and normalize.css appear. I'd encourage you now to just take a moment, stop the video, and take a look at all of these vendor libraries that are available that come with Drupal 8. One last thing before we move on to the next video. To introduce Symfony is to introduce object-oriented programming to Drupal. Symfony is developed in PHP 5, which Drupal 7 developers should already be familiar with. It makes extensive use of object-oriented mechanisms available as of PHP 5.3, so understanding object-oriented programming is a prerequisite to learning Symfony, and learning about Symfony's object-oriented paradigms is a prerequisite to learning about Drupal 8. Specifically, PHP 5 implements the object-oriented paradigms of class, object, method, inheritance, and more. As an example, let's just talk about YAML for just a minute. Symfony 2 introduces some important components that we'll be using in Drupal 8. We'll continue to see the value of these components as we work through the lessons. A YAML provides us a way to store what would traditionally be in arrays, but in a language-neutral format. Because of this format of indenting to represent arrays, spaces are really important, unlike what you might be accustomed to with PHP. We're going to write our first YAML file in the next learning module, but just remember indentation instead of enclosures. I'll talk more about that when we get to that part of the course. In the next video, we're going to introduce you to object-oriented programming, but if you're new to this, there's a lot of resources that you probably want to check out as well.